Sometimes there are games you see advertised, whether it be at a showcase or a trailer that pops up in your recommendations that make you go, I'd probably enjoy that, but it's not at the front of my backlog right now. Then time passes, you'll see it in the sale or highlighted in a collection somewhere, and you'll be reminded, oh yeah, I was always going to check that one out. And you finally decide to turn on your console, pick up a controller, and play, only for it to utterly exceed your expectations. The Pedestrian was one of those games for me. It's been sitting in the back of my mind for a while now, probably whenever it was first shown at an Xbox or PlayStation showcase a few years ago where I was first inclined to give it a go. Skookum Arts are the folks behind this creation of their debut title here, a studio formed at inception by just 3 homeschooled teens from Ohio. Before it came to consoles however, The Pedestrian was initially released in January 2020 after around 6 years of development. I bet they were glad they finished this by the start of 2020. The game plays as a puzzle platformer side-scroller, which I'm no stranger to enjoying, but this one had something else to it. Something that spoke to me on a foundational level. The art style, for one, is very visually appealing, and I'll touch on that in a bit, but I feel it was mainly the concept of this game choosing to go beyond existing as a traditional 2D platformer, and instead utilising modern urban architecture and iconography not just to have the core of the game world exist within, but to function as a canvas on which you play upon. That's what was such a new, unique idea. New ideas seemingly growing fewer and farther between in the modern gaming industry these days. The game begins in the simplest of forms, and where many forms of art begin, breathing life into a concept with the initial contact of pencil to paper. Beginning as a scribbly dot on the plainest of canvases, you are encouraged into movement, with only an arrow prompting you. Presented with 2 universally recognisable figures seen on any public toilet you've had the misfortune of finding yourself in, you must pick one, presumably whichever one you identify with. I'm a big strong man myself, so I chose to fill inside the man. I chose to embody the man here. From the very beginning with the introductory cinematic, the vibes presented here are so bright and charming, the art style being reminiscent, to me at least, of hand-drawn illustrations and animations such as Raymond Briggs' The Snowman, which is a timeless classic, but the 2012 sequel is better, and if you think differently then you're wrong. The game shares similar attributes to films like this too, having hand-drawn aesthetics and the entire feature completely lacking in any spoken dialogue, having to utilise its visuals to convey its narrative and emotional themes to the audience. After the introduction, you're shown how the game is intendedly built with this gorgeous cinematic feel, having the camera pan across the various scenes, slowly creeping across the environment extrinsic to each of the panels you play upon. The game restricts you to a 2D landscape, but not because the world in this game isn't 3D, to the contrary. The design of the game having the figure on screen being only able to move across a clean, minimal 2-dimensional space acts as a juxtaposition to the deep, cluttered 3-dimensional world sitting in the backdrop behind them. This lets the game's approach be familiar and unalienating to the player in the way it functions, but holding this charm and finish to it that I personally rarely see. Being in this game and feeling this world around you brings not just a new level of immersion, but a literal whole other dimension to it, implemented in a way which is such a pleasure to experience. Whilst you're fixated on playing, trying to figure out and navigate the various problems on screen, you're constantly being greeted with a new unique landscape whereupon the puzzles take place. As you yourself are locked in with all that's happening on the platforming section in and amongst the figure you embody, you're surrounded with this bustling, lively cityscape. An enormous world which you exist in, placed just in the background, barely relevant as you play and progress. Never the focus of the game itself, in many cases having the FOV slightly out of focus, but at the same time crafted in a manner that really does just add to the immersion, while simultaneously never being distracting or intrusive to the player. If you do decide to turn your attention to the greater world across the game, you'll glance quite comedic world building at times. Included is a company called Blarg Enterprises, with a name sounding like something off the top of someone's head, and credits in the form of graffiti to pay thanks to the people who crowdfunded this game in its initial stages. At least, I imagine that's what SHAGS stands for. It only ever serves its purpose of reminding you that outside of the street signs, traffic lights and notice boards you traverse across, exists a constant living city, full of life in every corner, using the collective hum of background noise produced by the various eclectic areas of the city as a building block, not just as in-game assets, but to help keep you focused in an almost meditative state. By utilising the plethora of signs and images that are plastered all over the modern landscapes we live our actual lives in, you get fresh new chunks of platforming, with differing yet familiar art styles from one to the other. The genius behind using these kinds of semiotics pertains to the fact they are easily recognisable to anyone, of any country, and detached from the barriers of language. For people in the modern world, road signs and traffic light colours are like a reactive flinch to us. Unconscious, ingrained and instinctual, this game represents the ultimate form of audience accessibility. This choice goes further, however, as it only lends itself in tying together the immersive world you're encapsulated in and the minimalist design of what you bear witness to on screen. With no tutorials or on-screen instructions, you are left to figure out how the game plays on your own. This intentional design decision of a HUD-less experience contributes to keeping the player engaged in what's happening on screen and encourages them to pay attention to each and every little care and detail put into the game world. Thankfully, because the game is built upon the premise of easily recognisable signage and symbols which keep each panel as minimal as possible, anyone can quickly work out the meaning of icons on screen and their correlated purpose. The platforming itself consists of familiar elements seen across 2D platformers. Doorways and ladders to and from an area on each side, solid and semi-solid platforms you may drop from, interactable objects like levers, keys and crates you need to interact with to progress, and hazards you need to avoid. All that good stuff. They're simple, recognisable game mechanics and you'll learn them quickly, but this doesn't mean there's a lack of challenge. Plenty of the puzzles you face get increasingly more difficult as you progress, testing your mind and sometimes your patience. The further you journey, the greater amount of panels in each scene you will need to handle and rearrange. Challenge lies in connecting one panel to another, often requiring a certain distance be met, and only specific elements in each puzzle being connectable. Doorways can only meet with other doorways facing the opposite direction. Ladders at the top of the panel can only be connected with ladders from the bottom of another, and vice versa. You will also come across some panels fixed in place, forcing you to work around these new obstacles that before you needn't have worried about. Eventually, physical objects such as drain pipes or whatever these are, also come into play outside of the panels you traverse, blocking you from progressing until you figure out how to bypass these objects in the material game world. Some of these are done by activating circuit boards built into the panels you move across, yet again adding another layer of complexity to the gameplay, forcing you to think about how you should progress in the 3D world whilst working in tandem with the little figure you embody on the 2D plane. Only by cooperating with both of these together can you complete these more complex puzzles. At multiple points of the game you'll find yourself at these central hub areas that disconnect to smaller puzzles in which you must find multiple objects to bring back to the hub area and use there in order to pass that particular section. Now, I'd be lying to say this game isn't without its faults, and very few debut games I imagine would be fortunate enough to have that statement not said about them. The only fault I do have with the Pedestrian, however, is still a rather small one, just not small enough I feel to be unmentionable. I personally came across various points where I experienced a difficulty spike at certain sections. Now, generally the game is very well paced, and although it gets more difficult as you progress, with puzzles taking more time and thought behind solving them, rarely did they feel frustrating. Just presenting you with a new dynamic you haven't come across yet and requiring a bit more brain power than before wasn't the problem. I expect a game to slowly work towards getting slightly more challenging as it continues. If you learnt how everything worked halfway through and were never presented with anything new, it would be a drag. A handful of times though, I did find it overly difficult to complete certain sections that, once I reached the 10 to 15 minute mark on playing around and trying different combinations, none of which I was successful with, I reached a level of frustration that left me feeling less challenged and thought-provoked and more irritated and fed up, eventually leading me to pull up a walkthrough because I had hit a wall and was no longer having fun. This particular one I spent over 40 minutes on, and that's just too long for a single puzzle. Again, these spikes in difficulty weren't just contained in puzzles at the tail end of the game though, where you reach a final climactic challenge to push you to your limits with all you've learnt across your playthrough. These most difficult areas in the game were oddly placed, seemingly dotted at random around my playthrough, and once progressing past them, the difficulty drastically dropped again, returning me to a state of fun once more. Maybe I was just bad at the game and missing obvious things I should have worked out sooner, but even if that was the case, I hope in their next title, potential future sequels or spiritual successors, they at least throw a couple hints on screen once you've sat on a particular puzzle for an allotted amount of time. When you craft a game with no set difficulty levels to choose from, a decision I'm still behind and have respect for, having objects glow for example to indicate I need to focus on them rather than other areas of the puzzle to guide me back on course would have been a small addition of great assistance. If this is something multiple people have commented on and they recognised, I hope they implement that going forward. The one thing that never fell short, however, was the soundtrack to this game, because my god, is it perfect. The score done here by Logan Hayes, consisting of slow piano melodies and an upbeat orchestral jazz track, is the perfect accompanying music to this title, suited to the scenes, matching and complementing this team's vision in the most wonderful of ways. They really could not have done better with their eventual choice of composer here. Outside of these criticisms, I found myself engaged and enjoyed manoeuvring throughout the beautifully made sections of the city, starting at the warehouse, moving below into the obligatory sewer level, because there's always a goddamn sewer level. In this game it's actually good though. Continuing through the busy city streets, relaxing in serene college campus and back alleys, before making my way onto the rooftops at night, where the lights of the city shined out and the rain gently fell around me, to the point I wanted to take a moment to myself to just enjoy and get lost in the metropolis I found myself in. On your journey with the Pedestrian, you'll find your actions in some instances directly influence the outside world, beyond the confines of the signs you are otherwise restricted to. You also periodically come across a small Game Boy Color looking handheld, which you occasionally cross over onto the screen of and plug in specific modifications to, making them appear physically on the device itself. Upon installing the final modification, your Pedestrian, who you've been embodying the entirety of the game, is transferred inside the handheld, and to my surprise at least, you lose control of them, beginning to play as an unnamed person in the world outside the 2D panels. This drastic and sudden change in the gameplay took me totally by surprise, as was intended by the developers, I'm sure, and this unexpected switch up in gameplay being saved for the end almost felt like a treat for the player. Gaining control over them, momentarily switching back into the body of the Pedestrian and transposing them back onto the sign to help solve a puzzle and unlock this door, you progress onto the rooftops. Sitting at the very top of the city that rests below, you now stare out across the sky, surrounded by nothing but a handful of skyscrapers piercing the cloud belt. Stumbling across blueprints on the adjacent rooftop, where you once again need to switch and traverse across as your 2D counterpart, you'll notice something not quite right. The environment on the pages here lacks any way for you to continue, but soon you'll notice that the answer to this puzzle lies off the pages and in the material world. Markings on the concrete and objects drawn on boxes that you can move from rooftop to rooftop show you that your actions on one plane now influence and affect the other. By cooperating with your body on screen here, you make your way to the final location of your journey, stepping inside an apartment block and making your way to the end of the corridor, where you come across some familiar images. Also, why is there a public toilet in this block of apartments? Like, that's weird, right? You step into the open apartment, and I just gotta say that this is an absolute killer place to live. I need to find a place like this. The vibes in here are absolutely immaculate. This place is small, but you get the sense of it being very lived in, by someone who's too busy to worry about the washing up. At least for now. Man, that pizza looks good. Reminders clutter the fridge, the bed lays unmade, and laundry is left to be done. Someone is busy with other things. But what? Inserting a floppy disk into the computer drive, we have one final puzzle to solve, unlocking a hidden area behind the wall of this room. We make our way through the tunnel and out into the sunlight. No longer above the skyline, we now stand looking out onto an ocean, with a lone boat waiting docked beside us. We step in, sit down, and let ourselves be taken away into the endless distance. I love a game which leaves its narrative open to interpretation. This journey leads our protagonist from a simple sketch on paper across different selections of signs and 2D platforms to finally finish at the highest point of the city we've been travelling through, and the last section of gameplay being a strange meta concept of crossing over the 2D and 3D worlds we inhabited. I thought was an incredibly fun and engaging concept, executed very well. I see this story's ending as entering a game dev or a coder's apartment as themselves, having worked tirelessly on getting their vision to work, getting the Pedestrian off these signs that scatter the world and onto their device, a challenge overcome, and then setting off into the unknown, onto the next chapter, the next journey, whatever that may be. I had a great time with my experience here. It feels special when a game speaks to you as the Pedestrian did to me, and I look forward to Skookamark's next game, currently titled Quiet on Set. I don't really care when they'll have it ready, I just hope they take all the time they need on that game to make it as impactful as their first. This will definitely be a game that sticks with me for a long time, and I look forward to revisiting it in the years to come. And hey, maybe going forward, I'll think twice before I send a game like this to the end of my backlog. Thanks for watching.